Y'all, I want to unpack this parable for us a little bit today, but I feel like before I do that, I want to go back and do a little bit of a primer on prophets and prophecy. Because if you were like me, I don't know, I was raised as a young boy completely misunderstanding what a prophet is and what prophecy is. And see if this sounds familiar to you, but for me, I was basically taught that prophets were like fortune tellers or soothsayers, right? Like somebody with a crystal ball whose job it was to predict the future. That's what a prophet was. And prophecy was a prediction of the future. I know I'm not alone in that because actually that even happens in the Bible. You see like kings of Israel that call upon a prophet to come and predict the future for them. And the prophet's always like, you don't understand how this works, do you? Well, it turns out that a prophet is actually less about somebody whose job it is to try to predict the future. And really, a prophet is a person sent by God to come and talk to us about the present, to show us the present moment. Rather than a crystal ball, we should be imagining a prophet with a mirror, like a hand mirror, showing us the choices we're making in our world, the lives we're living, and warning us about what the consequences of those choices will be. It's kind of, I liken it to a parent whose children are running down the hall in the house, and the parent says, y'all stop running through the house, someone's going to trip and get hurt, right? And the kids go, what do you know? And one of them trips, boom, face down on the ground, and the other one catches them, and boom, they're face down on the ground, and then they look at the parent, and they're like, you predicted the future, right? This may be hypothetical, this might not be. But, right, the parent didn't really predict the future. They were holding up a mirror to the choices that we're making and saying, be careful, because you're not going to like what happens as a result. Now, knowing that that's what prophets do, when we look at this gospel story, this parable that Jesus is telling us in the gospel story today, Jesus has a couple of important details. One is this realization that God has continued to send prophets, has been sending prophets all along, and will continue to. That we make a mistake if we just think about prophets and we just think about like Isaiah and Obadiah and Amos and Micah, and we think of these being these old folks from a long time ago. When Jesus wants his disciples to realize God has been and will continue to be sending people to have us look at our lives and the choices we're making. In our times, you can look at clear examples of people like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a clear example of a prophet in our time, who held up a mirror to our world and said, the choices we're making about labor practices and civil liberties are going to lead to division and disaster and death. Now, was he predicting the future? Or was he reminding us of what the consequences of the choices we're making are? He wasn't wrong, was he? He's a prophet. Now, the other thing that I think we want to get out of this parable is the understanding that while it may be really comfortable for us to look at this story and say, oh yes, we get this, we're like the prophets, we're the good guys, right? We believe in Jesus. We're not like those bad Pharisees, right? But it's important to realize that when Jesus is talking to his disciples, he's reminding them, y'all, you act like these tenants a lot, right? A prophet or someone comes into your world and exposes a hard reality, a hard truth that makes us uncomfortable. And sometimes our reaction isn't to change our ways. Sometimes our reaction is to silence the prophet, right? We can fix the problem of an unjust and broken world by changing our behavior, or we can fix the problem of an unjust and broken world by getting rid of that guy who's showing it to us. And what Jesus wants his disciples to be very careful about is realizing, when are we being like the tenants in this story? Let us not forget, Martin Luther King Jr. was silenced. Mohandas Gandhi came into the world was a prophet, held up a mirror to the world to talk about injustice because of race and ethnicity, warning people that if we don't address systemic injustices, that it won't go well for us. He wasn't wrong, was he? But like Dr. King, he was silenced. So I think an important thing for us to be able to do is look at this story and take away from it two things. One is looking at our world and realizing when there are prophets among us, warning us about choices that are being made in our world and realizing them for what they are, an opportunity to learn and change, to be a part of the solution. We are living in the midst of a great and growing mental health crisis right here in our own community. Unchecked numbers of people struggling with post-traumatic stress, whether from a storm, whether from hurricanes or coronavirus, anxiety and depression that come about as a result. And there's just not enough mental health care to go around. And we know that these kinds of things lead to unchecked domestic violence, substance abuse, suicide, right? If left to their own devices. Imagine a prophet holding up the mirror to our society and saying, but we can do something about this if we choose. We're also living in a time where plenty of people have been coming and showing us the hard reality of racial division and injustice in our world, systemic racial injustice, and basically saying, like the prophets do, this won't go well for us if we don't address it. It leads to violence and division. We don't have to look very hard to see that it does lead to violence and division. There has been lots of violence and division out there. But again, we can do something about that. We get to choose. That's the second thing. We get to choose. Are we going to be like the tenant and just silence the prophet, stone the prophet, kill the prophet, shoot the messenger, I guess, as it were? Or are we going to be aware of when that tendency is to say, what this prophet is saying to us makes us uncomfortable, but we have a role to play in making a difference? Y'all, I'm coming off of a little bit of a high from our In Common that we had this week, where we talked about what we can do as a community for mental health needs in our community and racial reconciliation in our community. We walked out of the In Common with all sorts of great ideas, but one of the things that was really clear is that it's not something that any of us can do alone. It's something that we as a community need to do together. So I'm asking you, if you want to be a part of making a difference in this world, if you want to be a part of looking at the injustices that are shown to us and say, I can do something about that, give me a call, send me an email, set up an appointment with me. Let me know that you want to be a part of answering this call too. Because together, one last thing we can learn from this parable is, it's not the prophet that decides what the future is going to be. It's we who decide what the future is going to be. Thanks be to God. Amen.